this time.
So there's an American lady recording this.
I hear her.
Danai, sorry, I was just saying to Nehemiah, I think I stuffed up that we'd agreed to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I just gone on with 11.
Did we?
Yeah, but Vulindlela said to me he can't make it, and I think Glenn was saying that this is a difficult time for him. So I was checking with Nehemiah. I mean, I'd be keen for us to continue, and then we just have we'll reschedule, well, not reschedule, but the next one reschedule will be for 3 o'clock on the Monday afternoon, if that suits you.
Yeah, 3 o'clock would actually be perfect.
Okay, cool. So maybe let's just do a short one then today. And then I was wondering if you had any thoughts, Nehemiah or Danai, after our last discussion. How did you think? What did you think afterwards? Did you have any feelings, thoughts, etc.?
For me, I felt good about just the conversation being initiated, and just feeling like it was a safe space to have the conversation. And even though sometimes the conversation will be uncomfortable, it still feels like a safe space in terms of us being able to be open and honest, and being able to engage. And the fact that from my experience, there aren't very many safe spaces to be able to engage on such a topic. And so I left the previous conversation feeling positive that this is going to yield just not necessarily amazing results, but just it's going to result in good things, and at least a starting point for us to create more safe spaces for the conversation to happen. So yeah, I was feeling positive afterwards.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, I think I share the same sentiments as Danai. Also coming into the space and trying to establish what the space would serve as, and what the space would entail, and how the interactions would work. I was also a bit apprehensive at first about it. But I think sitting down and talking it through, like and setting these kind of rules of engagement, if you will, and really coming to the table honestly with what we want out of the experience of these talks, I think was really helpful for me. Again, the idea of a safe space is always a welcomed one. Yeah, especially because when talking about issues as sensitive as race, they can sometimes be difficult to navigate, and sometimes more than most, they overlap with the lived experience. And so that idea was very important. But also the knowingness of the responsibility that you also have when you engage in a space like this, you know, and maybe making it clear that when you enter the space that you are not a representative and you are not talking for a particular group of people, or, you know, but you are sharing your personal story in the context of the theory or the language that exists around race and race relations, I think. Yeah.
Awesome, guys. Thanks. I mean, you know, from my side, the same thing. I mean, you know, I'm nervous of initiating this conversation because, in the sense, not in terms of engaging on the thing, but that I suppose that I abuse the privilege of having this conversation, you know. And so I was very encouraged after our last session that I think that we can do some good work in terms of getting to some of the underlying stuff that normally gets lost in these kind of conversations because it ends up being deflected, through various things, so emotional. So yes, so thank you, and I'm very encouraged and very honored to be part of the conversation. So I was looking, Nehemiah, just in terms of some of the notes from last time, and one of the things that we were talking about, Glenn was talking about this problematizing whiteness, and you were talking about the proximity or living in the proximity of whiteness. One of the things that you'd also raised is the difference between the United States, where critical race theory originated, and South Africa, where in the States, Black people are the minority and don't have political power, unless you call Obama political power in some form. But in South Africa, it's different. The white people are very much the minority here. I think we account for something like 8% of the country's population. And in terms, if you look at government structures now, are not represented in government at all, well, very, very, very few, but yet still seem to dominate the space. If you take the country as space, and I was just wondering whether that was your experience, and why that is, why.
Yeah, I think for me, I think that when I was talking about critical race theory and how we sometimes need to be cognizant of the differences when we engage in it, particularly of the United States condition and South African. Obviously, there are overlapping understandings in the concept, because racism is racism is racism. It's not going to be different where you go. But I think more so it is the scope at which it affects the people, right, in that particular region. If I can maybe talk about in the context of South Africa, that why in a majority Black community we might see the prevalence still of whiteness, it would tie into exactly our conversation of today, respectability politics, that concept of the proximity to whiteness, and I read a bit on respectability politics this past week, of how it is the minorities' assimilation, and you see now the definition also becomes iffy in a state like South Africa, because it's not the minorities' assimilation, but it's the majorities' assimilation. And I think where the difference comes in is that South Africa comes from a structure of power, where it was rule and it was enforced and it was culture, the racial disparity, when we look particularly at something like apartheid, the effects of something like apartheid, whereas you would find that the way that many South Africans would engage with race would be maybe different from the way in which me and my Kenyan friend would engage about race, because some of the nuances are lost on her that are very much present on my context, because the Kenyans had colonization and then the colonizer left, and Kenyans were given free autonomy to decide what happened in their life. And it's not to say that it was all roses and there was no influence by the West, because by virtue of us being in an African state, there's always Western influence, in how we do our work, in how we are allowed to trade, like Danai raised last week. It's a monopoly, and so I think that with South Africa, the difference is that where race was governmentalized, and so we come with that inheritance, and that is still there, because what we need to understand also is that we were at the discussions around the context of the visual arts vapor last week, where they were talking, and one of the presenters was talking about the concept of design, right? How systems are designed for specific purposes. And if you can change who is leading the system, but the system will always achieve its purpose, right? And you find that in South Africa, that I think is where our problem is that we had designed a system of practice and no work was done to dismantle the system of practice. Rather, the face at the forefront of the system was changed. So now we get the same thing where when in the apartheid government, it was all about skin color, right? In the post-apartheid government of South Africa, now it becomes something else because there's still a privileged and a non-privileged group, right? So class now becomes something greatly at play. You know, Blacks with access become the people who are monopolizing and who are hoarding the wealth to them, you know, because we know how tenders work. We know how tenders work. And once you get into the tender game, you can be there and monopolize that sphere for decades because you know how to write it. I get denied tomorrow. I get someone with a disability in 2 weeks for a different tender, and we all come together and we write because it's a system. And the system seeks to enfranchise those in power or those with power. And so when we come into a state then that thinks like that, and that bears the brunt or the burden of harsh westernization. Growing up as a South African, it was scarce that you would find South African content on television. It's quite a recent thing that you would find South African content being produced and created in South Africa. Far and few between would you see that. And I think that created this notion of we were being actively educated because now we know that representation matter. Now we know that what the media expounds us is what affects our life and is how the normal person ends up living their life or relating importance to a specific issue based on that. So I think it's really a complex issue, Gary, and there's a lot of things at play here that affects how a place where South Africa, where there's a predominant Black population, but the people largely remain still, if you would put the coin word to it, the people still remain oppressed, right? Because there's these after effects of an apartheid state that we are fighting. There is this idea of excess and keeping others out, right? Because there's a system at play that's going to continue perpetuating what it was forged to do, right? And so to me, it's no surprise, right, that things are the way they are. When you come to see the bigger picture, it's no surprise to you why they might be the way they are, you know? And I think when we grapple with these issues, we get closer to that question of why 25 years later, no systematic change has happened yet, right? When we start thinking about it that way, we start seeing why, you know? Okay.
You know, so maybe just to ask you, Nehemiah, I mean, is it your view that there is no systemic change that's taken place in the 25 years? No real systemic change?
Well, it would be really foolish to say that no systemic change has taken place, right? Because to some extent there has been change, but the extent to which that change has taken place and the extent to which that change has reached, it's not fully realized, right? Because if I say systemic change did not take place, I'm a hypocrite because yeah, I am. Sure. In a Zoom meeting talking about race, you know, it defeats the purpose. Yes, so yes. I think when we look at it at a micro level, then change has occurred, right? But on the macro scale, we can't quite see it reaching where it needs to reach because the system is built the way it is. Change is being gate kept, if you can say it that way, you know. Yeah.
No, I mean, you know, so one of the interesting things for me is that PE, in terms of the last census data, is the most segregated city in South Africa, and one of the most segregated cities in the world. You know, and we pretty much still live in the communities that apartheid put us into, with one exception, is that your middle class area is now more mottled than it used to be. You know, so you now have black middle class people that have come into the suburbs, but we still live in suburbs and townships and northern areas, and the inner city has become sort of for immigrants. You know, people that don't originate in South Africa. You know, so because that's their safe space. Yeah, you know, and I was trying to understand, you know, so often I go into a restaurant and I see only white people in the restaurant, and I want to walk outside and look at the door and see where the sign says only white people. You know, how does that message go out? You know, how you know, and then I walk into the Spur, for instance, where I go often with my partner, and then there's lots of black people and it's totally mixed. You know, and then you go, okay, well, I want to see the sign on the door that says, okay, this is a multiracial venue. You know, I mean, you know, it just astounds me, you know, that, you know, I swim long distance in the sea, and primarily that group is white people. I mean, I think in a group of 200 people, there's 2 or 3 black people that swim. Now, I mean, there could be, I mean, there's systemic reasons for that, but you know, after 25 years, you would have thought that would be more diverse, you know, that they wouldn't, you know, because it's a fairly easy sport to get into. You know, the entry costs are small. You know, you don't have this 100,000 bicycle that you need to buy to get into that sport. You know, it's you know, so yeah, so I'm perplexed as to why there hasn't been more fundamental change in our society in that sense. You know, why we remain segregated, and why we're so comfortable in that segregation. That's the, you know, I don't know. Danai, any thoughts from yourself?
I was just curious about, yeah, just especially on what Nehemiah was saying with regard to the change in the system, and the fact that, you know, we of course can see that there has been change by virtue of the fact that, you know, we are sitting here engaging in this conversation, that, you know, as Black people, as a Black female, I have access to the opportunities that I now have, and so forth. And I was just wondering now, the extent to which the change has happened. Now, this is just a question. Do you think this is on purpose? Do you think we could look at it as a purposeful limit to the change that is occurring, or the speed at which the change is occurring? If we think about, like what you mentioned, Nehemiah, the fact that, you know, there's a lot of gatekeeping that's going on, and in certain spaces, once you're in, you have the ability to control how things are happening, for example, with the tenders and so forth. And it just made me think about some of the discussions I've had with my students in terms of, for example, service delivery in certain communities, where you have, for example, a town like Butterworth. I think one of my students is from there, and she would tell me stories of the fact that, you know, they can go weeks without water, and they have to have trucks delivering water. They can go long periods of time without electricity, and it's not even, you know, a load shedding period. And so I'm just thinking, do you think it is possible that this is on purpose? That as, you know, as the face of the system has changed, perhaps it is to some extent purposeful that the speed at which change is occurring is at a slow pace. The extent to which changes are being made is at a certain pace just because it's more convenient and it's more beneficial for the face of the system to have the situation as it is. Because if I think about the situation in Zimbabwe and how, I mean, Zimbabwe got independence in the 80s. We had Banana, we had Bob, a lot of changes occurred. Similar to Kenya, the colonizer came and then they left, and then the country kind of had to do its thing. And for the most part, there was a lot of good that was achieved by the leadership. And then, yeah, the wheels kind of fell off. But at the moment, things are really bad. And in the current situation is that the way a lot of people see it is that, you know, for it's fine for things to be the way they are, because it allows a certain group of people, a handful of people, to profit from that situation. So I'm just wondering now, could we compare or say that to some extent that could be the situation here? Are things being done very slowly so that a handful of people can profit, whether it is the new face of the system, whether it is other people, the other face that is kind of working in the background? Yeah, I was just thinking about that as you were talking, that, you know, maybe this is on purpose, and we are sitting here engaging in these conversations, trying to, you know, find these solutions, but someone has purposefully made it so. Yeah.
I think those are very interesting questions tonight. I think those are very interesting questions.
Just make it a lot more complex than it was.
It makes it a lot more complex, but it also opens up a conversation that has largely been demonized, right? It opens up the kind of, it uproots the Pan-Africanist ideas, right? Because Pan-Africanism is kind of centered around those ideas that there is a big Ben, or what do we call that? There is a big brother, a big brother, or a community of people that are structuring the way we think and feel. While in South Africa, we don't even need to look far in our futures to see evidence of that. We see it now with the current inquiry that's occurring with our ex-president, where a particular family was filtering money into the government, or allegedly, let me use the word allegedly because this is a public platform. Allegedly, a family was filtering money into an ex-president's account to keep the kind of status quo, for them to be able to do business outside of how the regulations of the country orders that, right? We've seen that. I've also seen a couple of political analysts on TikTok talk about the relationship of the current president and the Oppenheimer family, right? And discussing the nuances between that, and we have to raise the issues of power dynamics when we talk about things like this, right? There are power dynamics at play, and power dynamics will ultimately win out how people react or how they act in circumstances, right? And whether you are the president of a country or you are not, those need to still be assessed, right? I think that there's a lot of things like that where we can see that there are players at stake here that are trying to conserve a place where they can profitably do business, right? If we just put it that way, if we look at it that way, because I think an overarching way of looking at it, that it's a mega conglomerate that is oppressing the Black people, is freaks me out.
Yeah, it freaks me out too, but I'm trying not to think of it in such a way.
In such a way, yes. But I do think that because we live in the system we love, Danai, and I think another, because I am a lot on political TikTok. I don't know why. I'm on race and political TikTok a lot. And TikTok seems to think that I am the one based on my picture. They think I am the one. And so they sent these videos my way. But interestingly, I saw this one video of, and I admire her a lot and I like her a lot, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right?
Yes.
AOC in America, right? And she kind of made this analogy of the capitalist system, that the capitalist system, you make a billionaire by ruining lives. Yes. She made this equation. A billionaire is made on ruining lives. Yes. And so if we look at it that way, with that analogy, you understand why the status quo of one family being kept for them to do business and increase their wealth is going to affect thousands of families in the South. Is going to affect thousands. And it just so happens that the predominant race in South Africa is Black. And so those at the lowest point of the food chain, when we look in the capitalist system, will be negatively affected by that system, right? We see this in the South, the small South in America, where fracking is occurring, where these companies are allowed to rampantly do as they please because they fund the state legislation there. And we see how the lives of those people is destroyed, on a decline, right? And so I think there's a lot of examples of this that we see that how it perpetuates. So sometimes we also need to critically think about it, that race might have been the intersect in here, but there's something else at play now that might be causing this, right? And I think when we think about those things of the purposeful nature of change being limited, then I think we can look at it from a capitalist standpoint, where we can see that, oh wow, the rich are getting richer, and because the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poor. Like, just the shameful thing, Gary, of a billionaire coming online to tell us all to please donate for COVID relief. Every little helps. And I'm sitting there thinking, are you insane?
Like, your fortune could fund this whole country, but we must donate.
You have a net worth of in the billions, and you telling me that my $5 is going to bring relief? How's about you donate 200,000 because it wouldn't do anything to your budget? And you're asking me to donate. And that's where you kind of start to see the cracks or the fissures in the capitalist system. That it's always going to try to maintain itself, right?
Definitely.
And I think this is where that also ties, Gary, that question about access, right? That question about access. And so the people in the townships cannot engage in sports such as swimming because they don't have access to it. There's no payment involved. It's free to sign up, but they don't have access to it, right? I grew up in an integrated PE suburb, which was very close to the mountains, where there was a pool, and the majority of my neighborhood growing up was largely Black. And those were swimmers. We used to go down to the big river that we jumped from the top in, and we were all medium to low level swimmers, and we actively engaged in the act of swimming as recreational. But you don't see that outside because there's no access to that, right? And I think that is also a tool that is possibly the most prevalent tool. Like Mandela said, that education will liberate the nation, right? But the extent to which we are educating is not quite reaching as far as it should, right? And also we need to raise questions about formal education, about what is the purpose of formal education, right? I think we are in a place in time now where we really need to rethink our ideas around formal education, what its purpose is, and how we might be perpetuating old structures by continuing with the status quo, right? And so maybe that could be some of those things that just clicked or came up to me while the two of you were talking about access and and this purposefulness of oppression.
Yeah.
If we compare Zimbabwe to South Africa, I mean, I know Zimbabwe fairly well, but I mean, I can buy the argument that there's a clique there that is in power, that, the guys behind Mugabe with, the diamond mines that have planes coming in and flying off elsewhere. So I can accept that there's a clique there that's actively engaged in perpetuating the system that allows them to stay in power. But in South Africa, I struggle to imagine a group somewhere sitting and coordinating everything. So I mean, certainly that took place with the Guptas. I mean, the evidence of that is clear, Bosasa is evidence of that as well. But it's these pockets all over. To me, I think the point is that the system itself, and I think of Fanon talking about what happens post-revolution, that if I understand Fanon correctly, what he was saying is that post-colonization, the new leaders just simply recolonize again. They just simply perpetuate the old system. And I think in South Africa's case, it's not necessarily that Rupert is sitting down with 100 other people and they are all conniving as to how to keep this going. But there's a subconscious, I don't know if subconscious is the right word, but there's a systemic maintaining, so to Nehemiah, what you're saying, that there's a systemic maintenance of this system that everyone kind of understands subconsciously, that this is the role of how we maintain. So this transition to peace, and if you look at it, So it's the what I think I was trying to point out is that the system it sits behind things. And now this sounds very Illuminati kind of thing, but that's not what I mean. But the pyramid is inherent. The access points are gate kept. And what we did in South Africa is we kept it by, we did it not just by white, but by European and English. Those were the gatekeepers, and those were broken down by Afrikaans white people, but they maintained the gatekeeping and they maintained the pyramid. And now we've broken it down again. But again, all we've done is race might not play as dominant a feature as it used to, in the sense of your ticket into the upper echelons of this pyramid, but it's still that pyramid still exists, and all it's done now is just found different ways to restrict access, to guard access, to give that access privilege, So like Nehemiah is saying, is the tender gang is very clear in terms of how they work. I scratch your back, you scratch my back, and we keep others out of this in order for this thing to perpetuate.
I don't, Gary. Maybe just to add to that, I don't think we can remove anything from the equation, right? So I wouldn't think that it would be fair to say that race no longer plays a role.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because race is always going to play a role, right? Yeah. I think that the thing is that, like when we look into the topic that we are talking about now, that we were wanting to talk about respectability. I think respectability now has come into the forefront, right? We've introduced that term of the respectability politics that goes on. So by virtue of Danai not having a heavy, what is associated to Zim, people from Zim, a heavy accent, she assimilates better to the context. And so therefore she's allowed into the context, you know, or she assimilates herself better into the context subconsciously by that. Or I assimilate, being a person who comes from a colored family, who lived in a colored community, but don't have the accent, right? Don't have the accent. I assimilate better into the spaces where I go into, right? And I think it's that concept of respectability. So for me now at the table, I am not like, and for lack of a better term, I'm not like those blacks, right? In Motherwell and stuff. And this is not of my own doing, because this is a system I find myself in. I have a speech impediment that I can't say R. And so if I were to speak like how I spoke growing up, it would be very difficult to hear what I'm saying because I can't say R, right? It would restrict communication. And so I've taken the approach to round my R's, to not say R, the hard R, because I can't say it, right? So I've taken that approach myself, but on a different level, someone else who doesn't know me can perceive that differently, right? Someone else who doesn't know where Danai was educated or the system in which she was cultured might think that, oh, it's a respectability politic that she's engaging into herself, right? Or the context where she finds herself in. So I think race is still going to play a fundamental role because we were cultured on race. So the markers might change that allows you to play, because we're no longer in blatant Jim Crow. We're no longer in blatant apartheid. You know, we're no longer in slavery. And so the door is open. However, when we look at our statistics, when we look at service delivery, when we look at things like that, it's very racialized, right? The summer strain will never go 3 days without water. That's just something that'll never happen. We will be let known that between 11 and 3 o'clock, we won't have water on that day, but it would be a very short period of time. Like in a small town like Jobatina, which is largely white, where my family currently does missionary work in, the service delivery is not even good there as well, because of how the politics of the specific region, these specific regions are, right? The town might be predominantly white, but the neighboring communities all colored and black, right? And so it's in a state where we can't, if I go home there, we don't drink the water from the tap, right? If we want to wash whites, we either have to come to PE to wash our whites, or we have to buy 20 liters of water just to wash whites, right? And because if you wash your whites in that water, you have brown clothes. The water is tainted and hard, you know, and it goes on. They lose power for days outside of load shedding, you know, because of those communities. There are people there that the people in the town or where my parents live have access to things like generators. They know that the power goes for days, so they can buy generators. So they're not going to make a fuss about the electricity going. We catch our own water, or we buy filters at home now as well to combat that wastage of money to buy water all the time. But we have access. But the people in the colored community next door don't have that. They don't have that, but they also don't have the agency, because they've never been taught agency to stand up and and they're not in a metropolitan where they can block the streets and prevent people from going to work, you know, for the government to finally start to think, oh, we must react, we must do something in this space. So I still think it's largely racialized, and the people who we perpetrate against are those places or towns or communities that are largely of a particular race though. And so when we look at it that way, we still see that the effects of our highly racialized society are still perpetuated. They're still prevalent in our day-to-day lives. They've not diminished, right? And I think we need to really, when we think about those types of issues, we really need to fundamentally think about grassroots change. What would that look like? You know, because you can't let a hungry dog into a kitchen and expect that it's going to leave the turkey sitting on the waist level table where it can reach, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry for that analogy, but that's what's happening, right? We are people that had no access, and all of a sudden now we have agency to build wealth, right? And so our first intention is to, and it's not all politicians, it's not fair to say that all the tender gangs are doing it, and all the, we do have some good players in the system, but you know, we know that what one bad apple spoils the harvest, you know. So I really think that there are multiple things at place, and I think that's why I was so excited for the idea of complexly engaging these issues, you know, because when we start to see these, at least we can form some type of roadmaps or some type of thinking to propose or to position that could possibly alleviate some structural abuse or damage that we have in our own system.
Sorry, that's me.
Danai, I also wanted to ask you about the question about a place like Zimbabwe, no? Where you were largely left to your own devices. And I want to also say that if you look into the larger works of that, do you think that it was Zimbabwe's own doing that they found themselves in the place that they found themselves?
In the place that the country is now?
Yes.
I think a large part of it has to do with, you know, like, the leadership, and there was a point where things changed. And I think I was still living in Zimbabwe at the time. No, actually I wasn't. I wasn't living in Zimbabwe at the time. So my family left them in 1997. And that's when we moved to South Africa. And I still remember we would go home every December holiday. And with each trip home, in my 12, 13, 14-year-old observations, I would see that things were different. They were not the same as how I experienced my upbringing. And by the time we got to the 2000s, like especially I think 2008 was probably one of the worst years, because I remember that trip particularly because we had to basically fill the boot with food because there was no food in the supermarket. And so we had to take food with us so that we wouldn't be a burden on my family at home that we were staying with, you know. So we needed to contribute something, and we weren't going to be able to do that from the supermarket, so we had to take stuff across the border. And so I think there was, I can't pinpoint the point where things started to change, but I would say a lot of the blame can fall on the shoulders of the government, because there were things that they could have done to prevent what happened and what is currently happening, but they chose not to, because in that system or in that space, with the way things are, a lot of them were thriving. A lot of them had businesses that were booming. A lot of them were building massive houses, were, you know, occupying land and not necessarily farming it very well, but they had land. And a lot of things were happening that allowed them to prosper and to thrive, while other people were suffering more and more and more. And so this is just my opinion, but I would say that, leadership at the time and currently can have a lot of the blame placed on them, because there were a number of ways to prevent what happened, and it just didn't. And it was better for it not to improve, because they wouldn't have the luxuries that they have now. So, yeah.
And I think that is largely a testament to African countries who differ or reject, right? A lot of the times, African countries who seek to claim their own autonomy on the spectrum, and who says to Tony Blair, you take your Britain and I'll take my Zimbabwe, right? That type of engagement is also not lost in the evolution of Zimbabwe, right?
Yeah.
If we are saying that Western countries have a monopoly over African countries, and this is clear when we look at Africa has all of the resources, yet they
the
are
poorest
the
continent.
poorest continent. Like it doesn't make sense.
Paradox of plenty.
Logically, it doesn't make sense, right? But when you start to look into it, you realize that there's ties and that there's trade with other countries, that when you no longer allow that to happen, things become grim for you, right? And that's why I think a country like South Africa will not, although there's fear-mongering around it, I don't think South Africa will quite reach the level of where we get cut off from the global market, because South Africa in itself is still largely dominated by the West, right?
I see what you mean, yes.
And so there's no benefit in them here to cut ties with us. However, with a country like Zimbabwe, where they actively sent out all of where actively Zimbabwe said that if you're not going to abide by our rules, then go, right? Where strict rules were set to that were meant to, at the time, enfranchise the blacks that were living in that state, rules that were put in place that were meant to seek to do reparations, right? Expropriation that was happening. These were very necessary things. These weren't outlandish demands. These were painted as outlandish demands, right? The colonizer came and they took. They came and they took. And now when we are saying, give a part back to the people of this land, all of a sudden now it's an outlandish demand, right? And so when we just look at those paradoxes, at those parallels, you start to see that how countries that abide by particular practices are allowed a seat, right? I mean, so Ramaphosa is the leader of the AU, right? And you ask yourself, like, he's not a great leader. He's not great politically ties. He's a businessman that just arrived yesterday, and all of a sudden he's a revered leader. Right?
Exactly.
Oh my word, I'm saying such awful things. I'm gonna get jailed.
I think in Zim, like you said, there were things that, I mean, by the time we got to the point where he was saying that you Blair, you keep your UK, you keep your Britain, I'll keep my Zimbabwe. I mean, he was already left of center by that time. And he was lashing out at everyone. And there were things, of course, that needed to happen. There were changes that needed to be made to ensure that this, the people of the country were actually able to reap the benefits that they should have, that they weren't necessarily allowed to have access to during British rule. And so there were things that were necessary. I think that the way that they may have gone about trying to achieve those things may not have necessarily been the right way. They could have been processes put in place that allowed it to happen in such a way that you are not, you're not isolating your country from everybody else, and you're not creating a situation where everybody's like, well, we're just going to put sanctions on you and cut you off from the things that you need. But I do think that as a leadership, the ZANU-PF has been in power for longer than I've been alive. I still remember the day that Bob said he was going to step down, although I don't think he was even in his right mind at that point. I mean, he was so old. He should have stepped down a long time ago. But I still remember, thinking about the day. His name is just gone. The leader in North African country. I'm totally going blank. Anyway, it'll come to me.
Not
I
Saddam.
remember.
Not Saddam. The other guy.
Up north. Gaddafi, where they were reporting on it, and I still remember the reporter crying while she was reporting, because she said he's the only president she's ever known. And that day in 2017, where Bob, first of all, said Asante Sana good night to everyone and spoke to us in Swahili, and then the next day he had stepped down. That was my experience, that this is the only leader I've ever known. And it was like he started off well, and then there was a point where it just started to decline. And he could have left as a leader that had made incredible changes to a country. I remember growing up knowing that this country is the breadbasket of Africa. Zimbabwe was ranked as #1 as far as literacy goes, one of the best education systems on the continent. All of these amazing things that he was able to, he didn't do it himself, but he was able to maintain in the transition from colonial rule to independence, and ensure that as a country, the citizens were getting quality education no matter what school you went to. Even if you were at a school in the rural areas, you would still come out of there with a quality education that would allow you to have access to things that would allow you to have access to jobs, that would allow you to have access to higher education and so forth. Ensuring that, this was a silly example, but if I think about it, just how what is the word? Wow, English is escaping me today. Almost like controversial it was that he said, in this country, we are not going to have genetically modified organisms. And I could see that, especially after I moved to South Africa, and I would go home and I would see how the difference in my body from the 2 weeks that I was in Zimbabwe, or 3 weeks over the December holidays, how my body changed when I was there eating the food there compared to when I got back, and how I was when I left. And so, all of these things that he was able to do, and they were good, and they were allowing the country to thrive. And then the wheels fell off, and people in the background obviously wanted him to stay in power, because then they would be able to cook the system and continue to, get a little money here, a little money there. And then eventually, you know, it was the kind of corruption that wasn't even, nobody was trying to hide it. Like, we all know what so-and-so is doing and what this minister owns and what this person is handing out tenders to his cousins. Everybody knows. It's become so blatant. And so I guess that's why I say, as the blame can fall a lot on their shoulders, because they had the power to change that. They had the power to ensure that you know, that things didn't get as bad as they are, and that people would continue to be able to thrive. People wouldn't be starving. Young people in their 20s wouldn't be working as basically a human cart to help you take your bags from the bus stop to the taxi rank so that you could get on a taxi and go home. It's heartbreaking, the things that people are having to do to make money in a country where everybody is educated, everybody is literate, and you know, everybody has the tools to be able to make a good life for themselves, but just the leadership is not going to allow that. Because if that happens, then they are not going to live the life of luxury that they are living.
Yeah, Danai, you know, I mean, it's very interesting. So I think I'm slightly older than you, so you know, part of my background is my folks got divorced and my mom remarried and then moved to Zimbabwe in '81 and went farming there and bought a farm, and then the farm was taken in early 2000s. But I mean, I remember going up to Zimbabwe often, and also you know, fantastic quality of life there. Sometimes there wasn't food, and sometimes there wasn't petrol. It was a
fuel, yeah.
But it, in the sort of late 90s, it was really thriving. And then I think there were three things that took place, if I recall correctly. The one was there was a referendum on the constitution, if I'm not mistaken, and the MDC.
Yes, there was. Yes.
The MDC did really well in that, their position.
Yes.
And then Mugabe did two things: is the land stuff and the paying of the veterans.
Yeah.
And it's the land and paying of the veterans that really, you know, and the irony is that the farming community had more land available than there was demand for at that time, but that didn't suit Mugabe. You know, so that was the one reflection. The other reflection I had is I happened to work for the tobacco industry for a long time, and in the growing area, you know, and Zimbabwean tobacco was seen as the second best in the world.
Yeah.
It was a very high
big export, yeah.
So all, you know, and in the sort of early transition, that was a free market where you would go to an auction and people would buy on the auction.
Yeah.
And then it collapsed, but it's back again. But this time it's not through auction; it's through contract growing, and it's the Chinese that buy up 90% of that market. Yeah, and I had a similar experience in Malawi and Tanzania, where what happened is that the old oppressor left, but a new oppressor arrived in
yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
so
China.
Malawi's parliament is built by China, you know. And in Tanzania, you know, the Chinese built a railway line that doesn't connect to any other railway line, simply to get the copper out of Zambia. You know, so you know, and I know that Kenya's port has been taken over by a Chinese concern because they couldn't service their debt, and so they, you know, that was one of our concerns around the nuclear thing, is that the government would sign surety, and the surety would be things like ports and airports and things like it. And when you couldn't service the debt because the debt terms are so almost impossible, it's like debt collectors and you know, the cash sharks in South Africa, the loan sharks in South Africa. You know, and it's just the system is perpetuated by those who want to maintain their privilege, you know. And
yeah,
Yeah, so it's like, it's my issue with Zilla, for instance, that she has this whole thing going about wokeness and that kind of stuff, and it just drives me absolutely mad. You know, that we're the most unequal country in the world. I mean, I think, you know, depending on which measure you use, there isn't a country that's worse off than us. And surely, you know, surely that's your like primary, you know, your evil. You know, that's your prime evil. You know, or unemployment is your prime evil. But yeah, we have the leader, the sort of chair of the opposition, talking about an American concept that somehow is going to lead to the demise of civilization. You know, and you kind of go, but where do you live? You know, I mean, you know.
Wokeness in South Africa solely exists on Helen Zella's platform, Twitter.
Yeah, no, I agree.
It's
the
true.
only platform that she has access to is Twitter, and that's where wokeness exists. But in the larger community of South Africa, none of that is known. And that's about 20% of the youth. 20% of the Black youth is active on Twitter. Yeah. And they are the people that Helen Zella is having her battles with. So she's not even traveling in reality. She's not even speaking in terms of reality, because the people she's in opposition with are people who could have no less concern with her or concern of the well-being of a country as a whole. These are people who are interested in Stan Wars and a popular culture, and she gets sucked up in all of that, right?
Yeah.
So the thing for me, Nehemiah, is how is she elected to that position? You know, everyone thinks she's nuts. You know.
Oh well, she's a great freedom fighter. Huh? Gary, where were you? Helen Zella is a great freedom fighter. I will not let you tarnish Helen Zella like that in this forum. Helen Zella fought against the apartheid regime tooth and nail.
She can be.
I'm just joking, Harry.
No, I agree with you entirely. Look, you know, the DNA are no longer friends, you know, and I now have a political career, so I obviously make political points too. But from a philosophical, sociological view, I don't understand how that could be. I mean, you know, from group dynamics and being in corporate culture, I understand how those systems work. But it's just gobsmacking to me that you can maintain this thing, you know, that you know.
I don't remember which socialist it was, Harry. I'm Gary, I'm saying. I don't remember which socialist it was, but there was this socialist who came up with this concept of the relativity of your wokeness as a person, right? So they make this construct that someone who comes from the 90s has a totally different perspective on what is politically just, what is ethically correct, when you compare that to someone who's currently in 2020, right? So they present this notion that your cultural awakeness or your politically correctness has an expiry date to it, right? As we develop more and more language, as we expound more, as more access is given for people to come into the space, our understanding of the concept becomes much more different than what your understanding of the concept was in the 90s, right? And so I think what's happening with Helen Zella is a refusal of advancement. She's refusing to give into what currently is culturally, socially, politically happening. She's holding on to a notion of when she came to the realization that there was something wrong with the apartheid government. When she came to the realization of there was something wrong with the apartheid government, it was purely on the standpoint of a humanitarian standpoint, right? It was purely on, you can't do this to these human beings, they are human beings, right? And so for her, if she didn't take any cognizance of her politics and to advance her politics. And she has been stuck in that one thing. Well, then modern South Africa doesn't quite make sense to her. Here's this bunch of kids on social networks who have all this access, who have all this humanity, telling her that she's wrong for thinking that the apartheid government did good to South Africa too. Telling her that colonization was a wrong thing when colonization for her was a much good thing because she's a product of it. She knows what it is. She, in her understanding, the colonizer brought structure, building, brought systematic things like capitalism, brought economy, brought trade, so for her understanding, she doesn't see where they are coming from. And that is an effect of her politically outdatedness. So that's why she can continue to perpetuate what she perpetuates, because she's still the same Helen Zille. She didn't change. She still thinks apartheid is wrong. But her politics.
You know, Nehemiah, I get that. I get I get her bubble, you know. I understand her bubble. What I don't understand is that, I mean, she's elected to that position and it wasn't a close contest. You know, so I mean, there were two phases to the thing, is that she had no substantive opposition in the election. And then secondly, she was elected, you know. Now, I know a lot of the DA people personally. I mean, you know, and you'd go, but how do you not see this? You know, how do you, why do you, you know, why do you perpetuate this? Why do you think that this is a good thing? You know, I mean, so I mean, her whole thing around wokeness and that is entirely in her own mind. You know, if she was railing against Black Lives Matter or something like that, then you'd say, okay, you know, some of that has come through to South Africa, but wokeness has had no foot in South African politics. You know, it is she who's brought it in, and she's brought in this deliberate right-wing version of wokeness. You know, this. You know, but I mean, I suppose, you know, not to focus on Helen, but this is the same thing with Ace. You know, is Ace is able to perpetuate a position even though it's very clear that he, you know, he's corrupt and, you know, so like in our local context here, we have a politician who likes smashing jugs and that. He's back, you know, he's been elected as the chair of his branch, you know. I mean, I get how that I get the mechanism, but I don't get the heart of it, you know. I don't get how people can do this. Well,
Gary, I've given up on politics because I've realized that politics are performative. Politics are not politics in itself is not connected to reality. It doesn't dwell in reality. The people who are there in those political positions are there because of an act. They are acting, right? They are not there because their morals align with any which thing that they are expounding, but it's because of the act and the performance and the political nuance of the situation. Let's not even talk about the fear mongering that largely persists all over the world now in our politics, right? That as a Black person, I wouldn't dare vote out the ANC, because if the ANC goes, it's back to apartheid. Back to apartheid for me, right? This type of fear mongering, right? And we shouldn't forget that politically, within these communities that follow that are part of the DA, Helen Zille has clout. She has clout. Yeah. And so it's the same thing that we are seeing like with the Donald Trump, where the Republican Party has to rally behind him because he has clout, right? He's got clout. He's got the people. You know, he's got the people because the people want him because he presents an America that they very much like. His supporters, he presents to them an America that they like. And so they would want to keep him in power. And similarly with Helen. Helen expounds an idea, an ideology of the DA that many supporters of the DA love. And so therefore the political leaders like yourself who can see right through that this is nonsense, right? But you can't remove her from that position of power, because when you remove her from the position of power, you lose your clout. You're going to lose to new parties that are forming. You're going to lose your people to a new party that is bringing something else, because these political parties become owned by these personalities. They become these personality things. Look at the EFF. The EFF is synonymous with Julius Malema. They become these cults of personalities, right?
Cult of personality.
No, absolutely. I mean, the EFF is very much structured on his personality, you know.
Exactly.
And that's why that's why they're in trouble at the moment, because the organizational structure has collapsed, you know. So but you know, and that's why he wants elections, what they call harmonized, because he can then run it on his personality basis, you know, because his messaging doesn't, in local governments, his messaging gets lost because he's, you know, he can't split his personality to every sort of local entity. And local communities see that, you know, but yeah, no, I mean,
for me as a thinking person, the concept of politics doesn't make sense. To have someone who has someone that could have no qualification, but just because you are elected by the people to speak for them, you now all of a sudden have so much power. And the extent to your power now is even where you can disenfranchise these very same people that you were meant to lead, right? That you were meant to fend for, fight for. You are doing the complete opposite, because there's no criteria, there's no rhyme, there's no reason. There's just, if I can come with my beautiful family and I can tell you, oh, we love the Lord and we are going to bring you clean water, you will elect me, right? But there's no qualification. In fact, someone who is qualified to do something is largely frowned upon in politics, right? Your education, like how long has Naledi Pandor been demonized in the ANC? Well, she's so educated. She's been a meme, like the politicians in the house have come to the floor and said, oh, you shashwa,
yes,
you with your shashwa, you think you're better than us, right? It's that thing where politics has been put to the to this sphere of being the voice of the disenfranchised. So it must be someone who is disenfranchised, right? To be able to obtain that position. And when we even look into this, like Gary, you wouldn't believe the performativity. There are students at NMMU who I am friends with, who I engage with rather, who are in these political sectors. But when they get into these political sectors, the accent changes. These are people that round their R's, but when they get into political stages, my comrade, I see you. This is a vital argument that we are doing here. But when they're talking to me, it's like, friend, so what are we doing this weekend? I'm chilling, I'm hanging. But when they get into the house floor,
that's exactly how it is.
We have to resist these notions. And if we just look into the education, we see that this person comes from Gray. Why does he have this accent? Right?
That's true.
And that's when you see how performative it all is. And I think in America, what we are currently seeing is how fickle the construct is when it's no longer endorsed or when it's no longer pushed in that way by all the players involved in it, right? That's why we're seeing democracies at wit's end in America. Democracies.
So, I mean, I think today's conversation has been useful in terms of understanding the systems of power. the systemic thing that's behind it, and race plays, and this point of yours that it's performative. Race is like you were saying in terms of accent, Danai had made the same point about accent, is that and often Black people that go through the sort of Model C schools and have these rounded, the rounded, as you said, rounded accents, go back into townships and lose it, because it's performative, the performative in the sense that it's what you perceive that drives a lot of how you relate to the world. And that system maintains itself, not necessarily through a group that sits at the top of the pyramid and makes the rules and that kind of stuff, but a collective of privilege and power there that sublimely understands how this thing maintains itself, So I get into the tender group, the tender gang, and I know to keep that gate, I let that gate open little bit, so that I can control who comes in. As soon as if I open it up, I will lose my privileged position. Yeah. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you. I mean, I don't know if how your time is, but I think we kind of set it for sort of an hour and a half every time.
Yeah.
And we're close to that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Next time around, is there anything particularly that you want to talk through, or?
I think as I was making notes, I highlighted this agency that's kind of stuck with me. Nehemiah mentioned agency, and in maybe later conversations, I think we should maybe explore that a little bit, and what it means as far as race is concerned, how your agency is taken away, and then what does that mean for you as a person of color? And I think,
and I as a white person just assume an agency. I never.
And
that's
like,
that's what a lot of my suburbanite fellows don't understand, is that when we have a problem, so Summerstrand won't be without water or electricity, because why? Because I'll go next door to the councillor and say, listen, when we're having a birthday party with my children, what is it, so I don't even see the agency. I mean, it's just
And I think it plays into what you mentioned near the beginning about, you can go into a restaurant and there's just white people in there. And in other restaurants, whether it's Steers or Spur or whatever, the fast food places, it'll be a nice mix. But as a Black person, I may not feel like that is a restaurant that I should be going to, or that I can go to, because that's not a part of the scope of my agency. And even with the neighborhood you live in, and I joke about this with my mom all the time, that they live in Hillcrest in Durban, pretty Lani neighborhood, and for some reason they always have the power cuts are happening a lot more than everybody else, and I'm not sure why. And it's really frustrating for her because of her work. But I always joke with her that, there was a white lady, a Karen in your neighborhood that just took it too far, and now they're punishing everybody else because of that particular person that complained just one time too much. But it's something that I know I live in Summerstrand, I'm on the Summerstrand neighborhood group. If there's a problem, someone will send in the group, here's the name of the ward councillor, you can call this person or whatever. I mean, and compared to Matlagi, where my friend lives, and he posted a picture of a glass of water, and I thought he was holding Stony ginger beer, but it was actually water from the tap. And I was like, why don't you call the ward councillor? And he said, because that's their job. And he was like, and he was telling me all of the stories about basically the neighborhood, people hate him because he came in as the ward councillor and he was very disrespectful to the people. They had issues with crime, and he was saying, we should collect money. Everybody paid 200 Rand and I'll hire security guards to keep everybody safe. And he was And, so it's like, again, this agency thing, like for me living in the white neighborhood, my first thought is call the ward councillor and complain, because that's what you should do. But for them, it's like, we must just suffer through the fact that our tap water looks like stony ginger beer when it comes out of the tap. So I think it could be quite interesting to explore this, this idea of agency and what it means for race and what it has meant for us now in 2021, and how we perceive life, how we perceive what we can and cannot do, what we should and should not do. I think it would be interesting to explore that a little bit.
Oh, that's very interesting. I'm sure if I type into my email account, "this is ridiculous," a couple of emails would pop up. This is ridiculous.
Yes, that's true. It's true. Yeah.
But you are on the neighborhood WhatsApp group, so I mean that's an achievement, It
is. I mean, I on Saturday there was a burst pipe in Admiralty, and I sent a message on the group, please can someone send me the number to report this? And in seconds, 6 people had responded, and there I was calling like a responsible person from the neighborhood, responsible citizen. There's a burst pipe, so that, we're already in PE, we have a water problem. And they had sent someone out. And I think in a different neighborhood, this would not be the case.
No.
It would have just been left to run. And
for weeks.
It's someone's job. Why should I call? It's not my problem.
No, absolutely. Awesome, guys. Thanks. So if we do it in 2 weeks again, it'll be the 7th of June, and we'll do it at 3, if that's okay.
Okay.
If that suits you. And then
I think that
to check with Vulindlela and Glenn, and we chat about agency next time, agency and race and how it works. Awesome. Guys, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. This is
thank you.
This is a great discussion, and thank you for the time.
No problem. Awesome. See you. Bye-bye.
Have a good week. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you very much.